We're really excited about this last panel, and I want to introduce Bridget Rollason, who's an award-winning journalist for the you win the award for the farthest travel, even though you keep the Australian Broadcast Corporation. She has been a political reporter with the ABC for the past 7 years. She now lives in London, though, where she works as a foreign correspondent for the ABC, covering European news, and also produces for the BBC. So thank you for hosting this panel.
Thanks so much for having me, Zach. So this is our second panel on the future of journalism. And I just want to say that if you've ever felt disheartened about the future of journalism or anxious about whether you're really in the right career, I promise that you're not alone. On my first day of my journalism degree at university in Australia that I'd been dreaming of since I was 8 years old, my lecturer told us point blank, there are no jobs in journalism, good luck. So I stuck it out, and 15 years later, I still have a very rewarding, fascinating career in London. But now we're being told AI is going to take our jobs, YouTubers and influencers are really where our friends are getting their news from. Misinformation is rife, and trust in journalism is on the decline. So we as a panel today are here to show you that it's not all doom and gloom. So this panel is going to explore how we survive and how we stay relevant in a rapidly changing world. It's going to be a solutions-focused discussion on how journalism can adapt in what is often a hostile information ecosystem. And our panellists today have done this. They've launched their own media organisations in tumultuous times. They've gained tens of thousands of paid subscribers in a matter of days by building trust with their audiences. And they've testified in Congress and parliaments advising world leaders about what needs to change to secure our future. So we've had our earlier panel look at some of the challenges that we're facing as journalists. So today we're going to delve into some of the answers. So we're going to help to provide you with some strategies for financial sustainability in journalism. So how do we get our audiences who don't want to pay for news to subscribe? What funding models are working today? And how do we make sure investing in journalism remains a priority for the public sector? Some strategies for audience engagement. How do we be useful to our audience? How do we combat news fatigue? And how do we better engage our audience so we can better serve the people? And of course, rebuilding trust, which is something we've talked about. We know over the past few decades, trust in journalism has been under steady erosion through the rise of fake news, polarisation, economic pressures in newsrooms. So how do we rebuild that trust? And what needs to change if we as journalists are going to survive this massive disruption we face? So let's ask our experts. So we have Peter Erdelyi, who's the Executive Director of the Centre for Sustainable Media. We have Veronika Munk, who is the Director of Innovations and New Markets at Denník. And we have Courtney Radsh, who is the Director of the Centre for Journalism and Liberty. So please welcome our panellists. And Courtney, I'll start with you. So I would like to generally know, what do you think journalism looks like in 5 to 10 years? And I'd also like to know how you think the current market is affecting the sustainability of journalism.
So I think this will depend on, in large part, what we decide about copyright and large language models and AI, because we saw what happened with the social media era when we basically decided to trade our hard-earned journalism. Costs money to go to a war zone, costs money to do investigative journalism, costs money to do freedom of information requests. And we said, okay, we'll give you this journalism for free, Google, Facebook, Twitter, in exchange for referral traffic. So we know that referral traffic has tanked, and we know that that initial bargain, which was initially between referrals, visibility, and the value that content provided, really got eroded as those companies came to also monopolize the advertising, digital advertising system, as well as the actual technology on which we built digital advertising. So now you have Google, which monopolizes 90% of search, taking monopoly rents, which means we don't make money from the digital advertising that we do, and the advertisers are losing money into a black hole. Meanwhile, social media, which is really only valuable if you have that good content, they built up this following because we put that great storytelling, interesting content that got readers there, and then got so little in return as they forced us to use their platforms and did not give us information about our audiences. They took the data without returning that value to us. Now, it's really interesting to hear about, BBC is personalizing news. Are we asking ourselves, what is this doing to the sustainability of journalism if we now create individualized echo chambers? What are we doing if we incorporate these AI tools that, again, the large language models have been created by a handful of US tech companies that stole everyone's content online? They bypassed your paywalls, they took your content, they did not credit you, they did not license it, they did not pay for it, and they don't plan to, because it's the only part of the AI system that they're not paying for. And they said, now we're gonna create these generative tools where we can literally create content instantaneously. Forbes, a couple of months ago, spent months on an investigative reporting piece. They published it. Within hours, Perplexity AI had created a duplicate, they had created a podcast about it, and they had created a video. Then they posted that online, and that got all of the traffic and the minimal amount of advertising. So this is all interrelated. We have to double down on the value of journalism, and each jurisdiction is going to decide how they treat copyright. There are jurisdictions like Australia that have decided that there is value created by journalism being on these platforms to these platforms, and those platforms provide value as well, and they're gonna split that value. They're gonna require that platforms pay for the news they use. You now have that in Canada and at least a dozen other jurisdictions around the world. So we have to rebalance the market. It's great to talk about trust. It's great to talk about what you can do, but if you are working against monopolies that control the entire information ecosystem, whether they're tech monopolies or state-dominated advertising, that is not an environment where you control the relationship with your audience, where you control your sustainability. So we need to have public policies that equalize the market. So this should mean that the platforms do not get to keep the data, that we create jointly the value for that on their platforms by using their platforms. Why did we decide that Google gets to keep all of the value from Google searches? We're doing half of it. The use of our tool their tool creates value for them. We need to separate out data. We need to prevent them from sucking all of the value without paying any of it in return. And we must rethink the generative AI seemingly inevitable innovation train that we're on and demand that we value the content that is underlying those tools, where it's great that we can use like a $70 tool, it's so cool, but ultimately we have probably only a few years left in journalism if we don't fix the public policy framework.
You really think there's only a few years left in journalism?
Yes, so Quartz just fired all of its journalists and replaced it with AI. You already have e-newspapers that are just created based on AI-generated content. You already have major newsrooms integrating AI into the news experience towards this idea of personalized journalism, which it can't be. You are not, you heard Arwa this morning. You are not personally relating to people when you're feeding them AI-generated versions of what they want. And nowhere today have we heard about the role of accountability journalism. Yes, your audience is that individual who's reading or subscribing. Your audience is also the public official, the business leader, the institutions of power that we are charged with holding to account. And yet we have fetishized this idea of the individual audience member and that our only role as journalists is to give them what they want. That's Netflix's job.
And you spoke, just briefly, you spoke about the policies. Are you thinking every country needs to be adopting these policies?
100%. And I think that we need a license, litigate, legislate strategy. So you need, you need to plug into the emerging AI content licensing marketplace. So most companies that are doing AI tools, like if you're doing a chatbot or some sort of generative search, you need access to timely, relevant information. You get that through retrieval augmented generation, a RAG, that basically goes up and updates a more static model with more relevant, updated information. There is already a nascent licensing marketplace because most companies can't afford to risk the copyright, right? So right now, it is unsettled in almost all jurisdictions whether or not copyright applies to AI-generated outputs. So if you want to be sure that you're not violating copyright, you need to make sure you have licensed content. So there's already a marketplace. Try it out, use it. Not individual deals, a marketplace. Second, you need to litigate. You should be suing these companies. So far, there are only 31 lawsuits against AI companies, most of them in the US, a couple in Europe, and one in India. We should see these all around the world. Check, see that you can look at the content that is used to train these models. They say you can't, but there are tools online now, and you can look at the data sources, see if there's any standing to sue them, and sue them. What happened to Napster? Why did Napster, probably half of you don't remember Napster, it was a free music exchange service that threatened to undermine the music business. They went out of business in part because they were sued. They couldn't afford the lawsuits. Microsoft and Google are offering all of their users indemnity and saying, we'll pay if you get sued for copyright. That must mean that they're making so much money off of this that they can afford to do that. And then we need to legislate. We need to say, no, it is not fair use or fair dealing to steal content. No, you cannot just create these tools that hallucinate. There is no way to prevent hallucination and false information in AI tools right now. So why are we integrating these into a fact-based profession? We should be much more careful about that. So we need a three-pronged strategy.
Thanks, Courtney. To Veronika. Now, you launched the news organisation Telex from scratch, which was entirely funded on reader support, and you also work for Denník, which recently gained 24,000 subscribers in 2 weeks. So I just want to know, how did you do it, and what are the takeaways from your experiences doing this in countries that don't usually have a high proportion of people who want to pay for news?
Yeah, just to give a little bit of context, I'm Hungarian, coming from this country where the government in the last 15 years treats independent media as its largest enemy. And then I switched to Slovakia, where there is another autocratic government which treats independent media as the largest enemy. So that's the context of my last 22 years. As I started as a political reporter, then I was an editor-in-chief, and then I switched to management roles where I am now. So what happened at Telex, which I was not the only one who built it from scratch. It's never I was the editor-in-chief, but not like a one-man job. It's always like a team effort which needed. What happened is that our whole newsroom, 100 people, it was the largest and most influential Hungarian independent news organization called Index, was took over by political influence. Usually how autocratic governments in our region doing it, they coming from the economical point of view, they buying up companies, not like the politicians directly buy, but their friends, their oligarch friends. I think here in Bulgaria, it sounds very similar when I'm saying this. And that's what happened with us at Index, that the management changed and the new management fired the editor-in-chief. So the whole newsroom decided to walk out on a single day. So this whole team said no in a country where usually people don't say no to the power. That's what we did. We walked out, and it had like this phenomenal impact, which meant that there were like thousands of people marching on the street, saying they would like to have that news organization back that provided unbiased facts for 2 decades. And me and my team, 100 people who walked out on the same day, we thought that, okay, there is only one mistake that we can do if we do not try to stick together and we do not try something new. So we went on YouTube It was a single YouTube video of me saying, like, please give us money, obviously in a more sophisticated way. And we explained that you know us guys. We provided facts and quality information and in-depth analysis in the last 20 years. So please, pretty please. And they gave 1 million euros in 3 weeks, which allowed us to start Telex, this new news organization, which is now one of the most influential news organizations, independent news organization in the country, of 10 million people, which is the last one on Reporters Without Borders lists among the EU countries in terms of freedom of press, even below Bulgaria, actually. And how? That was your question. I just wanted to give a bit more context. The how is going back to the roots of the values of journalism, like being transparent, explaining to the people that this is how we're gonna spend your money. So we don't like put it in our pockets, but we will spend like this, and this is the kind of quality journalism that we will produce from the money that you give us, and this many people will work all around the clock, 24/7, provide you facts, factual information, because we need to combat misinformation, disinformation, which in our region, coming sometimes directly from the government. So it's a hard one, not like combating someone else outside from the country, but it's coming from inside. Yeah, transparency and like classic journalistic values, like being fair, being curious, being impartial, and there need to be a crisis, which is horrible to say that, yay, good crisis, then we can rely on the audience. But I believe that, yeah, there should be a momentum where people wake up and they understand that they need to contribute financially to independent journalism. Because we can talk about journalistic independence from many point of views, but if there is no financial independency, there is no other conversation going after it, right? So that's what we did. We explained to the people, look, that's why you need to help. That's why you need to step up. And the Slovak company Denník, where I work now, which is one of the most influential regional publishing house, which publishes in Czech, Slovak, and Hungarian languages. And Slovakia is a 5 million country. The population is 5 million, and we have 80,000 subscribers, which, if you can like count it in New York Times scale, maybe it's even better in from counting from the population rate. But I'm bragging now, but I'm proudly bragging because the other thing I think that many people will say to you that no, people don't pay for news. According to my experiences from these two different autocratic countries, they do understand. There is a big proportion of people who understands that they need to step up, and if they want to have facts, then they will give like the amount of 2 specialty coffees in a month, right? Because that's like a subscription fee. And just very quickly summarizing this new success that we have at Denník. Denník turned 10 years old and have a history very similar that I experienced in Hungary. So an oligarch bought the Slovak news organization where my current colleagues work together, and they walked out and they started Denník 10 years ago. That's how I met them, and that's how we had inspiration when we started Telex, because it's already happened in the region. So Denník turned 10 years old, and we said that, okay, let's give back something to the people. And we said that, okay, we would like to have, we said a big number, 10,000 more new subscribers, which even for us, it was like a bit unrealistic. And we said that, okay, if we find 10,000 new subscribers, then we will offer 10 wonderful things to the society. And we gave 10 different promises like, If we will achieve 10,000 new subscribers, then, for instance, we will hand out our print newspaper to all the senior homes in the country. So elderly people will have the opportunity to consume facts and from a factual newspaper. We will train young journalists. That was another promise. We will, like, giving away free subscriptions for all the first-time voters, so we can educate society in a more in-depth way, and more like similar public service promises we made, and the audience reacted extremely well, because that's how. So if you give back, and if you invite the audience that come with us and let's do something great together, according to my experiences from the last 5 to 10 years, they react and they step up.
Thanks, Veronika. You talked about paying for news. It's the perfect time to move on to Peter. So, Peter, in terms of financial sustainability, some journalists here might think, but we can't get people to pay for the stuff we do. I have a feeling you might disagree with that. Do you have examples of how, I guess, smaller organisations have been able to convince people to pay for news in tumultuous times?
Sure. So I do agree with Veronika that if with the right offering, you can usually get people to pay for journalism, good journalism. I think it, of course, depends on the context, depends on the size of the country, the economic prosperity, the legislation, and maybe some other stuff. But I've seen good examples many places in Central Eastern Europe, including Bulgaria, Romania, smaller newsrooms, very few people providing services to their communities that they value enough to pay for it. And I think while there's a great deal that technology does that disrupts journalism in general, through AI, through disruptions of the advertising market and other means, I think technology also enables good journalism. There are now super lean publishing platforms. If you want to get into journalism, you want to start up now, you can launch a site on Ghost or Substack or any number of other platforms within a few hours with very limited or no technical knowledge, and you can create content, you can distribute that content, and you can monetize that content yourself. These technologies were not available the way they are even 3-4 years ago, and therefore it was a lot more difficult to find a sustainable business case for journalism. So I think, yes, you need to be really mindful of what people expect from you, and this might not be the journalism that some larger news organizations engage with, because that's more costly to produce. But I think for individuals and small teams, there are plenty of options to look at. And again, in Bulgaria, I don't think, so there's Nev and Red, which some of you may or may not know. Some of you are nodding at me, so I assume that's a yes. Nev and Red started in, March last year? And then they grew pretty quickly. Now they have, 70,000 subscribers on YouTube, and they have a pretty healthy Patreon sort of supporting group. Nev and Red is a two-woman show by Genka and Miroluba, and of course they have a studio and all that. But I think it shows you they didn't have investment from outside. They had an interesting perspective. I think similar to what Veronika described, they had a very strong origin story. They stood up for what they believed in. They did not compromise with sort of powerful actors that took over the newsroom they worked in. And they created something that I think is valuable, that contributes to public discourse in Bulgaria and enables them to make money on the back of it. So I think this is still very possible. And in some ways, it's easier or more possible if you're a lean organization than if you're a big one. If you're running a very big newspaper now with lots of staff and lots of production costs and a print arm and all that, you'll need to find more revenues, and that may be more difficult, but that is also possible because you can look at Telex and 444 and Denník and Kyiv Independent and all sorts of other good examples. So I think audience revenues are certainly a good option. I think it has gusto, I would say.
So as you mentioned, the audience revenue, you also work for a centre which helps people get institutional funding. So how do we make sure that investing in journalism remains a priority for governments and the public sector?
Okay, this is going to be a very entertaining bit about how the EU budgets work. So if you want to leave now, I completely understand, and I'm sorry preemptively. So, EU budget works in 7-year cycle. I was not kidding. A 7-year cycle. It's called the multi-annual financial framework. The current ones run from runs until 2027. The next one starts up at 2028. Right now, the EU says they are spending around 50 million euros a year on journalism or information ecosystem. I understand how this figure is calculated. If there's no one in the room from the European Commission, then I will tell you I don't really think this is it's not reflected in the day-to-day realities in maybe some of the Central Eastern European media markets. But let's take this number. So the Commission says this is what they spend annually. This figure, this volume, is largely logged in until the end of 2027, and the programs under which the EU funds journalism is also kind of what we have now is what we are going to have in the next few years. However, negotiations for the next MFF, the one that is starting in 2028, is already underway in Brussels and other major European capitals. And there are a bunch of organizations, mine included, but there are others, the Global Forum for Media Development, it rolls off your tongue, GFMD. And there is the Media Viability Manifesto Group, which is a group of large international organizations. So there are a bunch of organizations trying to ensure that journalism and the healthy information ecosystem stays on the agenda for the European Commission. I think, and this is very early days, the Commission will release the first budget draft for the next MFF in July. We'll see what that draft entails, and we'll know, okay, is there any allocation specifically for information ecosystem, and if there is, what does that look like? And then is going to be an awesome 2-year negotiation process, mostly between the European Commission and the Council, which is representatives of the member states, that is going to be haggling over priorities and programs and amounts. And I think everyone here, I would assume, has some interest in making sure that at least the funding there is now remains. And I know European funding is, it's not great. If you ever written a journalism partnership proposals, come to me, there's like a therapy session after this panel. It's not a great experience, I know that. And we are also working to maybe try to streamline that. That being said, I think it's important for large institutions like the EU to keep investing in the journalism ecosystem, not at least because the US kind of left. So just for comparison, the US was spending public sector resources. So this is US government, mostly USAID, also some other pockets, between, let's say, $200 and $300 million a year. This was 50% of all public sector spending on information ecosystem a year. This is largely gone now. Some of the money, there are still court cases over, but I think this money is largely gone, which has a devastating effect both in Europe and outside of Europe. So I think this makes it all the more important to advocate for some public sector resources from the European Commission.
Yeah, please.
Can I weigh in on that? Because I think we need to also look beyond just like media development funding. So we also have to look at like the other side, the costs of doing journalism. So you mentioned the Global Forum for Media Development, which is along with my center and OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and others did a survey of investigative journalism outlets and how much they're spending on cloud computing, which is likely to become a greater expense for every newsroom as they integrate AI. So most of them, the average, we're expecting for those costs to increase 100%. Why? They are using Amazon, they are using Google, they are using Microsoft. So they're, again, captured by these monopolies. So as there's this discussion around the Euro stack and around digital sovereignty, especially in the weaponization of US policy towards Europe and their efforts to exert digital sovereignty over their markets and over their information space, we have to look at things like the cloud and think about, okay, what kind of public policies could we enact for the cloud, which is on the other side of the, the budget, or the balance sheet rather, as an expenditure? Well, if you look at the mail, many countries subsidize media mail. If you mail a newspaper or a book, you pay a lesser rate. Why not apply the same perspective to cloud costs? Similarly, I think we have to take a broader look at the policies for journalism. A lot of the transparency regulation, for example, that's being implemented at the EU level only applies to accredited researchers. But we know that, frankly, journalists are often on the front lines of doing a lot of the research into the questions that we want to answer with access to that data. So we need to make it easier for journalists to access that information. So I think we need to see like public policies writ large. And then, as I mentioned earlier with Australia, France has come closest to doing this, right? Making the digital platforms that are responsible for, say, the polluting the information environment or contributing to the infodemic, like pick your favorite metaphor, the platforms play a significant role because of their business models, which favor engagement, which favors polarization, which favors disinformation at the expense of quality, more expensive information like journalism. And so you could look at having them pay a tax that could then be allocated to support journalism. And obviously you need rigorous mechanisms to prevent that from being used for political favoritism. Or you could require a fee, create a public interest fund. That's something that's being explored all over the world. So I think we really need to pull back from just media development and be like, ideally you want a marketplace that works for media. And so how can we create a marketplace, and how can we look at our full kind of digital policy scope and use their advertising budgets? The EU does a lot of advertising. I understand here in Bulgaria, for example, the EU does a lot of advertising, but it goes through the state, and then that's used to favor certain outlets over the others that are favorable, editorially. Well, put in place some new rules against that, or use an independent, allocator. Similarly, for all these institutions, use your budgets to advertise directly in the news media that are doing a good job, so that you're not just giving over more money to Facebook or Google and losing a significant percentage along the way.
I really want to talk about news fatigue, because we know that that's a big problem. So I'll ask this to you, Veronika. We know that every news organisation is dealing with this. We've had the pandemic, we've had wars, there's so much negative news around. What examples have you seen that have successfully combated that?
Successfully combat, that's another question, but there are some tools or some innovations that I think most of the larger newsrooms try, as we do as well, like repackaging information to be available for as many audiences as possible, because, for instance, younger generation doesn't like to read long articles, like long forms. Therefore, what we do, we usually repackage all of our articles to like social media explainers or shorter, more consumable pieces, to a print version, to the elderly generation who live in villages and like to consume news from a paper with a nice cup of coffee. So repackaging content and being available in all possible platform is a plus. Having said that, I know what you are I know what you are thinking, and I'm completely agree that we need to be conscious about it, that what are the disadvantages. But at the current state, these platforms are there. And the other thing is that it's not the news fatigue question, but I need to do a little bit of side road that I think in the future, in the close future, all of the big newsrooms and every news publisher needs to be able to somehow differentiate themselves from these large platforms and reaching and engaging the audience directly, like with newsletters, with real-time or offline events, and like not being this extremely dependent of the large platforms. And I mentioned just one more example that we are experimenting with, that, yeah, news are depressing, but we would like to offer different kind of services to our readers. For instance, we developed a game, like an online game to our audience, which is a word-based game, because we are journalists, so we believe in more like the language. And basically the aim is that please come back every day, please play with us. It's like New York Times has Wordly, so I think many of you knows that example. And it's not like you can play all the time and becoming addictive of the game, but you come back every day, you can play once a day, and it creates a habit. And I believe creating habit is one of the super important tools that can combat news fatigue, which is from year to year. There is this Reuters digital news report they provide it every year, and the news fatigue is one of their factors that they analyze every year, and it's becoming worse and worse. So there is no good answer, and it's totally understandable that why people are turning away from news. We just need to be, and again, you know, there is this 5 W's in journalism, like who, when, what, etc. All of us knows that. But I think we need to concentrate more on the whys and the hows, and helping people to make freer decisions and make their life easier to provide in-depth explanatory information. And that can help with the anxiety and the whole depressing part of news that we also provide to them.
And we've been talking a bit about the creator economy. Courtney, I'd like to know your views on the creator economy and how you think this might be affecting the future of journalism.
Well, I think actually creators and journalists share something in common. We, in general, have to use other people's platforms, you know, other like specific companies to reach our audiences. And creators, like journalists, are held captive to algorithmic curation, right? So all of a sudden, after Russia invaded Ukraine, let's all remember that is what happened despite Trump's terrible meeting with Zelensky. What happened was, as the platforms came under pressure from the US government and the EU to stave Russian disinformation and propaganda on their platforms, they ended up censoring independent Russian and independent Ukrainian media. So that's very problematic, because to your point, a crisis is also an opportunity when people are looking for information. So all of a sudden, these Ukrainian outlets, and we saw the same thing in Myanmar, you know, as the junta was taking over, couldn't monetize as all this traffic is coming to their news sites. Similarly, you know, you see all of a sudden Facebook pivots to video, journalists go out and like do more video, creators using video, only to find out that it was overstated and they actually lied. And then you're left with all this video capacity, you got rid of your editorial capacity. So we are held hostage to their algorithmic curation, their policies that are implemented through algorithms, their decisions about how or how not to monetize, you know, shadow banning. How many of you ever had a piece of content or your account shadow banned or removed on one of the platforms? Yeah, a lot of hands. That's pretty common. So I think that we should find our points of commonality with creators and rethink how we allow these platforms to operate in this space. So to your point, right? You have Patreon, you're using social media, you have to, because that's where the audiences are. But then we need to prevent this algorithmic manipulation. We need to break the business model that perpetuates disinformation and extremism and polarization. And there are legal mechanisms to do that. There are competition investigations underway into this dominance. There is the European Media Freedom Act, which has a prominence requirement for journalists. And I think creators, when you look at AI, they're facing the same thing. We know that we heard H&M mentioned earlier. Shein fast fashion, I don't know if I'm saying that right, is also apparently going around with their AI, looking at what's doing well among creators, and then using that to reproduce their own fast fashion and take over that creator. So I think we need to find our areas of commonality and put together a common public policy agenda, because voluntary guidelines have not worked. You know, requesting, demanding, asking platforms to do better, whatever, is not working. And the unilateral decision for them to be able to decide what is the value of the content that you're creating, whether you're a journalist or a creator, is problematic because it puts all of the power in their hands, and that allows them to split our communities. So, you know, when Facebook, before it got out of news, or in the Google News initiatives, pick the winners and losers over here. The YouTube creator, you know, platform, they pick which creators get to benefit and how much they get to make. So I think we need to take some of that power away from single dominant monopolistic corporations and find those areas of commonality, because we have a lot of commonality, and we are going to have to, I think, ally, as we've heard throughout today, with creators to help disseminate and get out the news, to communicate with people in their language, because most creators are not doing journalism. And they're often commenting on journalism or interacting with it, but we still need to make sure that that raw material, you know, the actual journalism is there for them to engage with.
Thank you. I think we have some time for questions now, if anyone has any questions for any of our panelists. If not, I can ask another one. Oh, yep. Graham over there.
So first, Denník, you know, the story there was incredible, right? I remember being among the people who would say about 12 years ago, like, this was in the Czech Republic, like, there's not a tradition of the giving, you know, for something that people are used to having for free. So I was very impressed at what happened then, what happened in Slovakia. I suppose this is a question for everybody, but maybe especially Peter. What are some of the mistakes that we in independent media are making when we are deciding to launch subscription campaigns or crowdfunding, right? Because I really appreciate how with your work, we understand that this is possible now. We're in another moment where many of the organizations I work with are doing crowdfunding campaigns, and it's a lot of separate work. And I wonder if there are just general things where you say, people always make this mistake, don't do this.
Okay. I'll give it over to you in a moment. No. You can tell people about their mistakes. So I would say, while audience revenues work in Central Eastern Europe, they may not be always as straightforward as the global north. People do have less disposable income, and therefore, I think, paywalls are really effective tools to get people to pay, but paywalls are tricky, because they may interfere with the impact of journalism, and especially in markets where people are not used to them, they may get an adverse effect. So I think taking it slow, I think this is not an either-or thing. It's not like either you have a paywall like the Financial Times and you cannot read anything anytime ever, or having even more than 90% of the content free, or even all the content free initially and then pay gating like 1%, 2%, 3%, I think is, to me, or in my experience, is a better approach to move gradually. I think people need to understand that this is always a marathon and not a sprint. You need to, the news organization, the newsroom, whoever is creating the content need to realize how this works, what the audiences need, how to get them to give money. This takes time. And you can, of course, read up on this stuff and kind of do some of the work ahead of time. And there are great online resources on that. There's the membership puzzle project, for example, and the membership guide. These are in English and Spanish and available for free, and they are great. I'm not getting a royalty or anything. I had nothing to do with it. And the audiences need time to sort of realize what's going on. And so you putting up a paywall today and expecting your audience to pay tomorrow is not going to be a winning strategy. It will take anywhere from, I think, 12, 18, even 24 months for any given audience of any news outlet to both the newsroom to get the hang of it and the audience to understand what this is about. So experiment a lot, take things slow. I think newsletters are great tools. Newsletter audiences are owned. If you have an email of someone, you can always send them an email. It doesn't matter what the platform is. You can have an Android phone, an iPhone, whatever. I think newsletters are also easy to gate. They are not subject to algorithmic filtering, not as much as some of the other platforms. I'm sorry?
They end up in your newsletter folder or your junk folder.
I think some people are having some financial success with newsletters. I think more so than maybe some other platforms, but it's neither of these things are perfect. But I would, in Bulgaria, if I wanted to start something up, I do a newsletter every 2 weeks. Veronika?
Well, about the mistakes that's possible to achieve. I think sometimes the crowdfundings are not telling the story right. The audience needs to understand why I should pay for it. Who are you? How will you spend my money if I give you? How are you different from the other similar podcasters, newsletter creators, etc.? And what is the added value that I get from my money? It's not just like, please give me money because I ask for it. I do have good experiences for this very single act that we asking for money and we got it, but those were these very special momentums, born in crisis. Not in Czechia. Czechia, there was no, when we launched in Czechia, Czech Denník, there was no crisis. We just used the recipe that we did in Slovakia and it worked out. But usually these large successes like Kyiv Independent, Telex, Denník was the ones that started with the fact that someone wanted to oppress media. So that's a good story, people understand it. So we are storytellers, right? So we need to do our homework in the right way, explaining people. So that's one thing. The other thing is that what mistakes, like not knowing the audience very well. Like usually I suggest that let's start with like a small target group analysis. Who is the people that I believe will consume any kind of content, and put out some readers survey and understand better that what they aim for. It doesn't mean that they need to do the strategy for you, but more like understand better how they think. That's another stuff. And like the third thing that I would mention, that journalists themselves who are being their own managers in forms of newsletter creators or small outlet owners, they need to understand business better. And they need, because usually journalists are like, oh, there are the management in the top of the company somewhere, so I don't need to deal with it. But I believe there should be much more consciousness on the journalistic level about the media economy and how sustainability can be achieved. And just one promotion, one like promo, because I think if we need to understand it's much better, we should all subscribe to Peter's newsletter, which is excellent, and he's writing about finance. It's free, thank you. free, and it can upgrade it to a paid version. And it's all about financial. Yeah, I think it's excellent. So, I mean, you need to find ways to create content that is interesting and meaningful to people. So that's why I'm giving the free advertisement in this conference.
And let me just add one thing, because I did, as part of a bigger report, I did an analysis of the crowdfunding platforms and all of the journalistic projects that were on like Patreon, GoFundMe, et cetera. And then I did interviews and read all of the research that have, like the studies that have been done. And a few of the takeaways from that were, don't launch a crowdfunding campaign if you don't have a network already, right? A crowdfunding campaign works when you have a network. So that's like the first thing. Second is have a plan to convert your funding patrons into members, ideally, into something more sustainable. And it worked a lot better outside of the crises times. So definitely crisis was a time when you saw more success. When there was like amplification by another cheerleader in, say, a bigger market or a wealthier market that could get it some of the momentum going.
Yeah, just to add to this point, one-time payment is great if you're in trouble. If you need to raise 5,000 euros because otherwise you need to look for a second job or a first job, then I think crowdfunding is a good option because that's the quickest and you can raise money. But the act of payment is complicated. It's not, sometimes it's about the amount, but sometimes it's just the act of payment is complicated. When you get someone to pay, it's always better to ask for a recurring payment. So a payment that is regular, and therefore I think it's a very good point to, if you convince someone to pay once, then maybe work on that person to make sure that he gives you that 3, 4, 5 euros every month.
And to get them off of the third-party platform into your own ecosystem, because a lot of those platforms, you don't get, again, the direct link with that audience. So that's another like failure. I mean, a lot of them didn't even, I think most of them raised less than $2,000, the vast majority of crowdfunding. And many of them raised nothing.
Yeah, and these platforms charge you over rate. Yeah.
Right, so again, like, you know, another form of intermediation.
Okay, there's a one up the back there. Okay. My new friend from Georgia.
Hello, thank you for all the important information and insights that you've shared with us today. My question is following, coming from the country of Georgia, which is the media, if it might be known or not, is actually very heavily oppressed and censored by the government. And the country is not big enough for the world to care in a way. And I believe that those are the countries where the future of the journalism is actually under very big danger. So what would you recommend those countries do to raise awareness in the world, or actually, is it actually a problem that could lead to something bigger, or is it just a problem of those countries, in your opinion, and they should be dealt locally, or is it actually a global problem that needs to be dealt with?
I mean, I'm going to be brutally honest. I think that we are in a very different geopolitical environment right now where no one cares, and that maybe the EU cares a little bit within its borders and its immediate surroundings, but I think they care more about investing in national security, which for some reason they don't think includes investing in quality information. So I think we should try to like reorganize that. But I think that it has to be domestic, right? And yesterday I spoke at the opening of the Lidl offices here because their corporate social responsibility arm is like investing in local journalism. And one of the things I did is try to show actually how economically beneficial it is when you have a free press, how that translates into more foreign direct investment, higher GDP, more ability to issue municipal bonds, like very hard economic impacts. And so I think making that case locally and getting the private sector, you know, to invest in journalism, like ultimately again, to find these strange bedfellows, and I'm not talking about investing in journalism like giving money, but advertising with journalists, subscribing to local newspapers, and really seeing how actually pushing back on government repression has a negative impact. So enlisting the private sector and the NGO communities and others to push for greater access to information laws. So in Georgia, for example, what I was reading, it showed that it is actually ranking very high on the ease of doing business ranking, and that's related to, in part, the access to information law that was changed from being a access on demand to a default on demand to a default provision of information. And that really helped improve access to information, so you could see, and that was for public procurement contracts, so you could actually see the crony capitalism. Other businesses would like call up media and say, hey, we saw this sketchy contract, why don't you guys look into this? The media could keep their eyes on it. One thing that access to information law did not include, the public procurement, was for state advertising. So big hole. That's where there should be demand from all sectors and from the EU, which is a big funding partner there, to require access to information, proactive provision of information about state advertising procurement. I know it just sounds like so in the weeds, but it's those, structural and the economic, where we can create these allies among different players, whether it's creators and journalists, the private sector, business and journalism. Like, there are actually shared things, and that might help, because we see in countries with less access to information that you have higher threats against journalism. So maybe one aspect.
I think that's all we have time for. So thanks very much to our panelists, to Peter, Veronika, and Courtney. And I'll hand back to Zach.